Hello, I'm Erwin Loy, Policy Editor at the New Humanitarian. Every year, we publish our list of trends that are driving humanitarian needs and shaping crisis response. Emergencies are growing more complicated and more costly. So, what's the way forward? Is the humanitarian system fit for the future? We brought a few people from across the aid sector to talk about today's urgent needs and what change could look like. Here's our discussion. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. And Happy New Year. I think I can still say that. Welcome to the New Humanitarian's annual event on trends driving humanitarian needs. My name is Erwin Loy. I'm Policy Editor at the New Humanitarian, and I'll be moderating today's conversation, which is about navigating 2024's humanitarian landscape. We're broadcasting live on Zoom and social platforms and our podcast feed. So thank you all for joining us wherever you are joining us from. In our annual flagship list, we give our readers an overview of the trends that we see driving humanitarian needs and the ones that we see are shaping crisis response. So that includes military sieges, water scarcity, the impact of deterrence and migration policies, government's refusal to deal with pariah states. And these are just some of the factors that we'll see an estimated 300 million people need emergency aid this year. There are tight donor budgets, the political climate, mistrust up and down the multilateral system. These are some of the many pressures challenging and shaping aid policy in the coming months. So I think we all know the story. Budgets are shrinking, humanitarian needs are not. So where do you even start? What can individuals, communities, governments, and aid groups do differently? So with that in mind, we've brought together a range of voices from across the humanitarian sector to discuss what's driving crises and the next steps in addressing them. We want you in the audience to be a part of this as well. So please get involved in the chat, tell us where you're from, where you're working, what you're working on, and comment on what our panelists have to say, and ask questions using the Q&A functions if you're on Zoom, or the comment function if you're on one of the various social media feeds. So we'll get to our speakers very shortly, but before we jump in, I'd like to get a sense of how everyone is feeling in 2024 with a little poll we hold at the start of the year. I think they'll come up on screen. And our poll question right now is, how are you feeling about the year ahead for humanitarian response? Are you optimistic that the sector is improving, that it's more effective, locally driven, and better at building long-term resilience? It's a really loaded question. Are you in a state of panic? You think needs are overwhelming and we just can't keep up? Or a sense of dread, which seems like the same sort of family there. Maybe you're confused, things are changing, and you're not sure where you fit in the landscape. Maybe you're tired, you feel like you've worked really hard and only inched ahead. Or perhaps you're hopeful, you think times are tough, but there are reasons to believe that things can change. So I'll wait for you to fill in those answers if you can. And while you do, I have to tell you a few things. Please subscribe to our free newsletter at thenewhumanitarian.org/subscribe. And I want to thank also our members and our donors who make these kinds of events possible. Members are readers who donate monthly because they want to see this kind of journalism thrive. And you can become a member by visiting thenewhumanitarian.org/membership. And you can find all these links in the chat and engage. Again, I encourage you to say hi, introduce yourself, and comment about what's going on and ask your questions. And so one question I'm going to pose at the start to think about throughout the entire conversation, both for our panelists, but also for everyone in the audience, is what is one thing you would change that would make the system better in your corner of what you work on? What's a small step that could improve humanitarian response just a little bit? And maybe we'll hear about some of those things over the course of the conversation. So I think we are ready to look at the poll results. And it seems to be a bit of a split between sense of dread, which is a bit alarming. Needs are rising, and reforms that the sector has tried to make for years have not worked, and pretty pessimistic that things will get better. But there's also 28% of you who are a bit hopeful, think that times are tough, but there are reasons to believe things can change. So that's a bit alarming, but also probably a bit expected. So we'll see if that changes over the course of this conversation. First, I'd like to go to some opening remarks to get us started. I'll turn to my colleague Heba Ali, who is a CEO of the New Humanitarian. Heba, as you've probably seen, will be stepping down from her role as CEO after more than 12 years at TNH and Erin, which was our predecessor. Bonus points to those of you who can name the full name of Erin in the chat. We'll soon have more news on this front, but for now, over to you, Heba.
Thank you so much, Erwin, and welcome everyone. Every year when we publish this list, I look at it with an eye to try to piece together what connects these trends, because I'm interested in what are the levers that you can pull that then have positive spillover effects on everything else. And it's often quite difficult to do. And I think in the past, things like climate change or the impact of the conflict in Ukraine tend to rise to the fore. For me, when I look at this year's list, ultimately, what connects us all is an abuse of power and privilege. And if you think about the root causes of conflict, of violations of IHL, of climate change, of displacement, what are the root causes if they are not linked to an abuse and an unfair distribution of power and privilege? We saw that during COVID and the inequitable access to vaccines. We see it in the context of climate change, where the countries that have least contributed to it are paying the highest price. We see it where the permanent members of the UN Security Council can block any action to prevent violence against civilians, whether that's in Ukraine or in Gaza, when it suits their interests. So I think we're at a moment today, especially in the wake of the conflict in Gaza, where this dynamic is coming to a head and where the world is waking up to just how serious the implications are of having such an unfair playing field at the international level. And as a result, we're starting to see countries that haven't historically had power demanding it, whether that's the rise of India or South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice or Barbados leading efforts to reform the World Bank. And I think that has to be part of the way forward. It isn't humanitarian aid, but it may well be the best response to humanitarian crises. So why do I say that? I think today it's not much of a subject for debate that the needs are significant. And when they reach a certain scale, the dealing with them downstream through humanitarian relief is no longer a winning strategy. And if, as we know, on average, 40% of humanitarian appeals remain unmet, then nearly half of the people who need help aren't getting it. So that model isn't effectively meeting the needs. And in that landscape, to me, it becomes imperative to look upstream and ask, what needs to change in the broader architectures such that these needs start decreasing instead of continually playing whack-a-mole or running on the hamster wheel, trying to keep up with all of the crises that surround us. So I'm sorry to be a bit esoteric, but since this is one of my last events with the New Humanitarian, I figure I have permission to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture. And I'll just leave you with this thought. Last week, we had a senior humanitarian official speak to our board of directors, and he said, the peak of humanitarianism is behind us. And his expectation was that 2022 was a peak for humanitarian funding. The pot is not going to grow, and government funding to humanitarian organizations is a model that will be fading out over the next decades. So his question was, what is emerging beyond humanitarianism? And I think that is the question for 2024 and beyond for all those of us who care about reducing humanitarian suffering around the world. So with that, I will leave you to the discussion and very much looking forward to everyone's thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Heba. Thanks for setting us up with some of the key issues on our plates. I'm going to introduce everyone on this panel quickly, and then we'll go from there. So I'll just list everyone who's here, and then we'll get started with questions. We have Samira Nouri, who's Deputy Director General at the Citizens Organization for Advocacy and Resilience in Afghanistan. We have Jeremy Konundijk, who's President of Refugees International. We have Jana Nakube, who's Deputy Chief Executive Officer with Crisis Action, which works on the protection of civilians in conflict. We have Uni Krishnan, who's Global Humanitarian Director of Plan International. And we have Steve O'Malley, who's Director of the Peer-to-Peer Project, Director of Eastern and Southern Africa for UN OCHA, which is, of course, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And I think Steve wins the longest job title on this panel. Congratulations on that. So let's start with just a quick round of questions for each panelist in the order I just listed there. 1 or 2 minutes. Just want to hear what's one thing that's keeping you up at night, what's dominating your attention right now, and if possible, what is a small step that can be taken by you or others to begin addressing it? So first, let's go to Samira Nouri. Samira, what's on your mind? What's dominating your attention right now?
Thank you so much, Arwen, for having me on panel. Before I answer your question, I want to just highlight that I'm not only here as a Deputy Director General for QUAR, but I am also a national NGO that's working in humanitarian sector since 1989 in the country. I'm also representing as an advisory, strategic advisory group member of education cluster, and also chair for the Civil Society Empowerment Network, local NGO network, and also executive member of the DRN, a civil society network for resilience, focus on resilience and disaster-prone region in Asia, and also local leader and near a global network of the local and national NGOs. So coming to your question, looking to the complex crisis in Afghanistan, it's not just one thing to share and could say that dominating my attention, but within my capacity and experience, if I could talk about that, how education programs are suspended right now, or as a female worker, if I talk about the ways that we are trying to serve girls and women, and also to get back the female humanitarian worker in response, or if I talk about the terrible drought over the past 4 years in the country, and then I'm thinking about the water scarcity and also the food insecurity, and also the thousands of people that are affected by the earthquake in Herat last year that still they are in a recovery stage. And also some of the restriction that put in place and navigating the political roadblocks in aid delivery, and these all restrictions are in place that really dominating my attention. And when it comes to the one step for tackling all these issues, I cannot say that one small step can do something. Rather than we have to think about the long-term planning. And it cannot be a small step to say that, yeah, the small step is a small step. But in fact, we should think about the long-term program, because the current humanitarian response that we have, we really cannot do to overcome or to tackle these issues. The one thing that we really want to do as a small step, that all UN agencies, local and national and international NGOs, to come together and push all the donor governments to really support the long-term planning and funding, because we mostly hear about the nexus, and this is what nexus is, to tackle the crisis and emergency by setting up the long-term solutions and long-term funding, that we are dealing with ongoing crisis. So these are the steps that can be taken to make a progress. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Samira. Thanks for starting us off. Jeremy Kananda, let's go to you.
I'm very seized at the moment with the really stark deterioration in respect for, or at least perhaps the appearance of respect for, international humanitarian law that we've seen over the past year and a half. And I think this is really driven by the global responses and the very kind of divided global responses, both to Ukraine and now to the situation in Israel and Gaza. You know, you've got, on the one hand, you've got the US government vocally calling out IHL violations when Russia does them in Ukraine, and on the other hand, being very muted and putting far less leverage on the table around what's going on in Gaza and some of the, what to all appearances are clear violations of IHL by the government of Israel. You've got UAE calling out very vociferously what Israel is doing in Gaza, while at the same time they're shipping arms to militias in Darfur that are conducting certainly crimes against humanity, if not outright acts of genocide. South Africa takes Israel to the ICJ, while at the same time they're welcoming the General Hemedti, who is leading those violations in Darfur. So, kind of in all directions, you've got IHL and kind of the use of IHL more as a cudgel for realpolitik than an actual set of principles that everyone should adhere to. And I think that's extremely dangerous for humanitarians, because we know there's a pretty direct correlation, and all of the instances I just mentioned are great examples of this, of the enormous human impact and the enormous human suffering that is created when there are these kinds of violations of IHL. And of course, that's why IHL exists and why we have that legacy from after the Second World War, so that we as a world would try not to do that kind of thing again. And it does feel like, and look, there's always an element of realpolitik in how countries use that, but I think it has really been heightened and magnified over the last year and a half by those two crises. And that in turn is driving a lot of the kind of budget crunch and the gap between needs and resources that Heba referenced at the top. Huge concern about that as well. The global funding ticked from 30 billion to 40 billion in 2022, and then back down to 30 billion in 23. And needs continued to go up, and they're likely to continue going up this year. So it really does feel like the whole system is pretty rickety. And some of the fundamental underpinnings, both in terms of the values and principles and in terms of the financing that we've long relied on, are shakier than they've ever been. And I think that drives some of perhaps the dread that seemed to win the poll at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. And I will get to many of those points in the coming 90 minutes. Next up, we have Jana Kube, who's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Crisis Action. Jana, what's dominating your attention right now?
Thanks, Irwin. Firstly, I want to use the opportunity to congratulate Heba for her leadership in the last 12 years of the new humanitarian, which has become such a stellar reference for all of us. What's keeping me up at night, to be quite honest with you, is the brokenness of the multilateral system. So very similar to Jeremy, the sense of how our multilateral system is no longer fit for purpose, be it at the United Nations level globally, or for me who's sitting in Africa looking at the African Union, and the sense that these institutions are no longer working in a manner that is responding to the needs of ordinary people on the ground, the brokenness of trust, the sense of double standards, particularly at the global level. And as Jeremy is pointing out, these holes in the international humanitarian law, a sense of like there are no shared values anymore that we have as a people and the world around us. And maybe even what then makes me really feel a lot frustrated is a sense that we are relying on the same states, you know, that have brought us to this situation to rebuild some sort of global togetherness in response of the challenges that the world is facing. But what gives me hope is looking at things that our partners do. At Crisis Action, we build coalitions of organizations and individuals who are willing to compel those with power to make decisions that are right for ordinary citizens caught up in conflict. And even as we see a proliferation of crisis around the world, our partners are ever more energized to do what is right by civilians. And so that really gives me hope that in the face of what might look insurmountable, that there are organizations and there are people who are willing to do what is right and come together and work together for that.
Okay, thanks so much, Jana. Uni Krishnan, let's go to you at Plan International.
Thank you, Irwin, and thank you, the New Humanitarian, for inviting us and looking at what we are already seeing in the chat box and listening to other panel members reminds me how much we have in common that unites us when we start looking at some of the bigger challenges. There are a couple of things actually on my mind. To start with, I think this has been touched in a different way. The complete erosion of some of the basic human values, such as compassion and kindness. We see it dominating how much this is being violated in many places where we work. And then also a complete disrespect and disregard for some of the principles, starting with the humanitarian principles and some of the rule of law and all range of things. On a practical note, 800 million people, close to 800 million people going to bed hungry tonight. That's if you put all the hungry people in the world in a single country, we know it's the third most populous country in the world after India and China. And that numbers keep increasing or keeps changing. And then you add some of the the things which the New Humanitarian has given in its forecast for 2024, such as the climate factors, the conflict factors, then we see how this could get out of control this year. So that's quite a big worry. And also at the same time, we also recognize that the other headlines that has come up in the New Humanitarians in a forecast for 2024, Sudan, Gaza, Darien Gap, and all these places. If you also start looking at how things that unfold in neighboring countries could impact this. For example, there are 60 countries that will be witnessing national elections this year. So we know in some places, there could be some positive change. We always look forward to democratic processes, but also we also know elections could also trigger in some places violence. So are we preparing for it? And how are we preparing for it? And will the elections result in further shrinking of humanitarian space, or anti-LGBTIQ sentiments, or anti-refugee sentiments, etc. But I also recognize one more thing. It's not a very gloomy world. I would go with 28% of the audience who said that they are hopeful. And I'll give you 2 reasons why. I was in a place called Piura in Peru recently, and I was working with the Peru team there, and we met a group of young girls who were just going around mapping certain places where they believed they had difficult experiences in the form of either sexual or gender-based violence during the last floods. So they were just going around mapping locations, and they were absolutely determined when El Nino plays out in the form of floods, this time they are much better prepared. And then also things like, some of these really small initiatives where children and young people are really leading the change. And I sincerely hope these are replicable examples. So what makes me hopeful equally when things keep me awake in the night is some of the small initiatives by a small group of children and young people, and what impact it could have in local communities.
Thanks so much, Uni. Steve O'Malley at OCHA, could you bring us home with a couple of minutes on what's dominating your attention right now?
There we go. No, great. Thanks a lot. And first, I'd also like to start by thanking Heba for the incredible leadership over the last period of time. And I also think that this report is really a strong report. And I really found that the trends that you had identified, both in sort of a sectoral way and then also in a broader way, to be super helpful. And I can understand, I was reflecting when I was looking at your opening question, and recognizing that I was feeling all of those different emotions at the same time in one way or the other. So, I mean, to me, the thing that, and it's been addressed already a bit, but to me, the thing that I guess keeps me awake most is this issue of the fracturing of the multilateral system, the sense that, as others have articulated, that the system does not work as well as it once did. That we see this suite of violations of international humanitarian law across the board, and we also face real difficulties of access in so many different countries. The ability of people to access services and the ability of humanitarian workers to provide those services, whether those are bureaucratic impediments or visa restrictions, et cetera, and the impediments put in place by different armed groups against civilians and their ability to receive any service. So starting from there, that is the kind of overarching feeling. And then when I drop it down another level and looking at the challenges we're facing, for example, in the Horn of Africa, where, because of a confluence of different factors, whether it's conflict, climate, displacement, we face really large scale needs, and with the possibility that those needs are going to be significantly larger at different parts of this year, and as others have indicated, at a time when resources are not going to be what they were before. And I honestly feel that a lot of people are still only at the beginning stage of understanding what the consequences of that actually is what that's going to mean for the ability to continue and provide programming in many places. So I guess that's the concern for me, the ability to meet people's need under increasingly difficult circumstances. What gives me hope? So what do I look at? Very fortunate to be part of this peer-to-peer project where we have conducted a number of missions to support humanitarian country teams. And there, I would say, despite the slow progress against around localization, against the grand bargain targets and promises and so on, I actually see enough that makes me feel like perhaps 2024 will be a year when we really start to see a bit more real progress. What I'm really impressed by in talking to national NGOs wherever we've been is frankly, the refusal to accept that they don't have a full seat at the table. So it's very clear for me that national NGOs are making, and local organizations are making an incredibly strong pitch. And I think that coupled with some possibilities in terms of improvements in financing arrangements, et cetera, that to me is something that gives me hope. Like that, I think is a wave that that is carrying forward. Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, Steve. And I know we'll talk about a lot of those issues very, very soon. I think you mentioned a report there. There was a question on there in the chat. I think what you're referring to is
your report.
Our crises. We have an annual look at crises and trends affecting humanitarian needs and humanitarian response. And I think my colleague just posted a link in the chat there. And I'll reference that now with our first question. One of the trends that we identified as being particularly noticeable this year is migration policies, how governments are using their policies to deter migration and how that could lead to more deaths and more abuses. The US and the EU are doubling down on prevention through deterrence strategies and trying to export these kinds of policies to countries of transit and origin. That's a continuing trend, obviously. At the same time that we see the rise of the right in the coming year, populist politics returning, or they perhaps have never left. They're shaping public sentiment and adding pressure on humanitarian groups. So for this, I'm going to turn to Jeremy Konyndyk, first of all. Jeremy, as you know, we're seeing an erosion of political support for asylum. What are the implications of this?
The implications of this, I think, are potentially the whole political support for maintaining the system of asylum and global refuge that has existed since after the Second World War. What is really changing in the last 10 or 15 years is as larger and larger numbers of people are arriving through irregular channels to the US and Europe, many of whom, not all of whom obviously, but many of whom do need asylum or some other form of protection. Western countries are reacting to those large numbers by, they're not adapting their systems. They're basically trying to find new and better ways to deter people from coming in the first place. And I think there is this kind of wide assumption in my own government and in many governments that there is some formula they just haven't found yet for deterring people from coming. And once they find that, they will be able to address the problem. And I mean, that's just not true. And the risk here is that as countries, the countries in kind of low and middle income countries that host 75% of the world's refugees, as they see this, they are already feeling a kind of total erosion, total collapse of global solidarity for hosting the world's displaced. And at the Global Refugee Forum that UNHCR hosted in December, it was really striking to hear from countries like Jordan and Colombia the very, very strong feeling that the world is abandoning them and kind of leaving them to their own devices in hosting refugees, and that's not tenable for them. And I think the wealthy countries are fooling themselves if they think they can, on the one hand, treat asylum as a domestic policy issue totally separate from the global refugee issues. So the risk over the next 10 years is if we see these trends continue that we've been witnessing now for the last decade, I think we face a potential collapse in political support for the global asylum architecture, similar to the kind of erosion we're seeing in the global IHL architecture. I neglected to say earlier what gives me hope. And I do have hope. I think on this issue, what gives me hope is that fundamentally, I don't think any of the things that the US and Europe are trying right now are going to work. Deterrence doesn't work. It's going to take longer for their political systems to recognize that. You're seeing some European states already quietly beginning to recognize that and quietly beginning to open up some other legal channels for people to migrate. But I think we will be able to get to a point where there's a much better system of global, humane, supportive global management of migration and protection for those who need it. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take more failure, I think, and more failure in our political systems to get there. But I think we will turn that corner at some point because we have to. The alternatives just simply don't work.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. Uni, I'm going to turn to you, Uni Krishnan at Plan International. Sort of the twin trend is looking at all the elections happening this year. 60 countries, I think, holding national elections, plus EU Parliament. By some estimates, that's half the world's population. What are you watching? And maybe more specifically, how should the humanitarian sector be engaging with these sorts of political dynamics? And maybe even more importantly, what is the effective response to this? It's one thing to notice that it's happening, but what are humanitarians supposed to do? How do they change what they do to account for this?
I think you have touched on the crux of the matter, that, and also most importantly, to recognize that humanitarian action and assistance cannot be a replacement for human rights and political action, and that transformation that is needed in many of the pockets we are talking about. So the elections, to be very clear, there is no way. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. So citizens and others engaging more actively, lobbying different political parties to place some of the fundamental values, and most important, to start with, to treat fellow human beings as human beings with that dignity, and also recognizing they do have rights, irrespective of the fact that they've been displaced across and sometimes within the border. So some of those issues, and we know it's not very easy. And I would believe that with 60 countries going through national elections this year, it's even more important we do everything that is needed to place this on the agenda of different political parties who will be competing there. I'm saying this because recognize the I would say the level of inequality that exists in this world. Most of the time we hear that there is no money in this world, but I think it's fake news. For example, if you look at between 2020, I'm just looking at the figures from the Oxfam's report, since 2020, just 5 men in this world have mobilized more than $400 billion in a very short period. In short, $14 million every hour. That's what they were getting. So this whole event, which the New Humanitarian is organizing, if you look at the collective profit they are making in 5 hours is nearly $70 million. I find it very difficult to believe that there is no money in this world when we start talking about less than $3 that go into education for a refugee child over a period of time. And recognizing every crisis is a protection crisis, why some of those basic things deserve attention. So most importantly, making governments to recognize that fundamental ideas of dignity and the rights of people, including displaced and refugees, really matter this year more than ever before.
They matter, but Uni, how does it affect you as a humanitarian organization? What is something you do differently? Just noticing Pakistan is holding elections in the next couple of weeks. If you're sitting there as a humanitarian planner, looking ahead on the landscape, how does that affect how you change what you do, or does it, or should it?
I can't name any specific country because we never know what will happen in one country. But if you look at the trend analysis about elections, we know elections are volatile times where there could be more violence in some places, not everywhere. So all the more reason why we should be preparing and making communities and even agencies ready in the event of an election and widespread violence and displacement. How are we going to respond to the needs very quickly? So that's one aspect. It's a very straightforward, pragmatic thing to look at. The second is, we shouldn't be working in isolation. The humanitarian actors should not be working in isolation with the bigger civil societies in those countries. So what can we do to work with them? I would say the human rights groups and other civil society actors more closely and collaboratively to influence the thinking and planning within the political parties who will be competing in those elections. And I remain very optimistic. For example, we have seen some tremendous I would say simple, very localized, but some fantastic results. For example, that the cards, simple set of cards which children produced calling for climate action in Timor-Leste, Somaliland, etc. How this initiates a conversation with the government and possibly other political parties, getting more traction in the ongoing conversations.
Okay, thanks, Umi. Samira, I'm going to turn to you. I did mention Pakistan on purpose in that example. You and your colleagues see firsthand in Afghanistan, I think, the effects of migration policies, and in recent months, we've seen hundreds of thousands of Afghans been forced to return to Pakistan. And I think the projections, if I'm not mistaken, would be 1.46 million people predicted to return from Pakistan and Iran this year. Could you shed a bit more light on what you're seeing on the ground and some of the experiences you can share?
Thank you. As we are working and we are responding to this crisis, with the influx of returnees from Pakistan and Iran really put us on more stress because already Afghanistan was dealing with the existing crisis like major displacement due to drought, the drought response, the earthquake response. So these all with very limited resource or limited funding resource really put us on a pressure that how we can respond, because the small scale projects that we are having or all the humanitarian actors that are responding to this crisis is not enough. Like we are not able to target all the vulnerable people in the country, and especially the returnees. And the returnees also need the resettlement kind of program to be provide for them, and also integration of these returnees within the community. And with such a small emergency response, we are really not able to respond to all these issues to find solution for this. And from other hand, there is also like kind of restriction on the development fund for the long-term solution for the resettlement program from the development donors because the current government is not recognized. And while the current government is also requesting the donors to have a long-term programs, but there's a kind of clash between these two parties of current government and also the donor governments, that they are only providing the fund for the humanitarian response. And through that humanitarian funding response, we are also not able to respond to all the returnees. So there is a kind of stress for these returnees that we are receiving, because already we had lots of number of other issues in the country to respond, and sanction, economy decline, and lack of job opportunity for these people, and providing job for these returnees. So it's a kind of a really protected crisis in Afghanistan, that we are receiving more of these returnees, but we do not have a plan unless we are responding that through that small scale projects of humanitarian emergency response projects that we are receiving. So it's not enough, but we are really thinking about the long-term or durable solutions. And we are just having the request from the donors that if they are having an issue with the government because the government is not recognized, but there are 40 million people in the country that they are deprived from their basic rights. So why should we leave behind these old people there? They are in need just because of the government that they are not recognized. So only we need to receive the humanitarian response funding, not the long-term funding for the long-term programs. So this is the situation that we are dealing on the ground.
Thanks, Samira. I think you identified the sort of contradiction there that's going to come up again and again. And I know we'll come back to that, I think, in dealing with kind of solutions or the idea of what humanitarians should be focused on when it comes to resilience and climate action. First, I want to turn back to Jana, flip the conversation a little bit towards trust in the multilateral system, which has come up quite a bit early on. So Jana, with crisis action, you're focused on the protection of civilians in conflict. But I think we just have to look to the destruction of Gaza to see the price that civilians are paying. And how, so the question is, how should humanitarians approach protection when international humanitarian law can be so easily ignored? Can you share your perspectives?
Well, I can certainly share what our partners are doing and not backing out. I think with the recent moves that we have seen of wanting to track back on the UN, the UNRWA, and seeing our partners come together actually in key political markets in the UK, in the US, to engage their governments and really continue to insist for them to do what is right, and engage in making proposals of what those governments are seeking to do. I've been also really very encouraged, right, by the act of solidarity, and I feel kind of a resurgence in belief in acts of solidarity again. I think if you had just looked at mainstream global media, you would have not known the amount of human beings that have been pouring out in the streets of capitals around the world, literally, with one resounding message of ceasefire now, which our partners are pushing and echoing across their cities. You would have not known that, that is going on. But, we are seeing social movements and NGOs and humanitarian organizations also rising to continue to beat on this message. And you then have begun to see some of the politicians begin to make utterances that indicate that some discomfort is being felt by some of these organizations, by some of these leaders in the US, for instance, is a very good example. So I think that gives me hope, regardless of the continuous onslaught, which is highly regrettable.
Thanks for that, Gemma. I know we'll come back to that shortly. I wanted to turn to the topic of funding and prioritization. Steve, I'm going to turn to you for this one. I think a key change in 2024 is the availability or less availability of money, depending on how you see it, funding for humanitarian budgets. I think the clear message from donors is you have to prioritize, but then the question is, how do you prioritize when everything feels like it should be a priority? So, this year's global humanitarian overview, I think, was a few $1 billion less than what it was the year before, in no small part, I know, due to some wrangling from your organization. So how are humanitarians approaching prioritization? What are they balancing when making these sorts of decisions about who to target and who to leave out? Can you shed some light?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I mean, I do think that, as I said earlier, we're going to face a very difficult year where, although we have received a lot of communications, and when I say we, I'm saying a variety of people on this call, other organizations, and so on, we've received indications of what the funding environment's going to look like. I think the real that bite is just starting to be felt in terms of well, what does this mean for our programming? How much longer can we stretch certain things that we were intending to do in the face, as I've said, of growing needs? And some of that is just, it's growing needs in terms of the normal climate cycle, the weather in a particular calendar year, rather than climate change, which I'll talk about differently. But we did go through quite an exercise this year with the humanitarian needs overviews and the humanitarian response plans, the so-called humanitarian program cycle. And it attracted a lot of attention because, as you said, Erwin, we went from somewhere around 56 billion as a total ask in 2023 to around 46 for 2024, which is the first time that we have had a downturn. And the fundamental reason for that change was by asking, in a sense, the questions in a different way. And the question was, who are we trying to assist? And once we started with that question, rather than what is the assistance we have for them, but trying to start with that question, who are we trying to assist, and what do those people need? That did lead to a much more focused set of appeal documents. And again, not because there was an arbitrary financial cap set or anything like that, because we went through a much more targeted exercise of trying to determine who were the people who in greatest need. That being said, and you know, that request is, in fact, the number of people in need is still larger than the number of people in 2024 is still larger than the number of people we reached in 2023. So it's again not as though there was an effort there to cut people off the rolls. The important thing is to try and think differently, right? And that I hope is the bigger point in this, that we try to think differently. And that is, as I said in my initial remarks, like, how do we make better use of local actors? How do we change the way the system works? How do we take out some of these onerous coordination requirements? You know, again, without getting too granular at the field level, this was a big concern from a lot of our colleagues, that they were getting so wrapped up into these appeals in these planning and processes that it was actually really detracting from their ability to actually do operational work. So, so to me, I think that focus, who are we trying to assist? And then what can we do? Where are those people and what can we do? I think that change, accompanied by some of the other issues that I've talked about, is the way we'll end up, in my view, at a more prioritized and a more joined up approach.
Thanks, Steve. You talked about, you know, flipping the question of who needs help. I'm going to turn to you, Uni. I mean, there are still some tough questions and some tough choices to be made here. You know, the global humanitarian overview, I think the number of people targeted is much less than the people in need, which is normal, but the gap is pretty big this year. So that does mean that some people are not targeted, people are left behind, and that's often women and girls. I think we see that with some of the funding. There was a report from the Parliamentary Committee of the UK House of Commons last week about the effects of funding on sexual and reproductive health and rights from funding cuts over a few years in the UK. We all know gender-based violence. Our programs are always underfunded and first to go often. We had a story this week about some of the funding issues for gender-based violence. So, Uni, what are you seeing at Plan International? What are these sorts of choices that you have to make? Because I think your organization describes some of these choices that you were faced because of the UK funding cuts, for example.
Irwin, that's a really good question, but not a very easy one. But I'll try to cover two angles with this. So first of all, if you look at what we are told in the sector is that here is a small piece of bread. You compete, you figure it out, and cut, divide, and take it. Are we really looking at, is there anything more we can do to set up more bakeries at the local level? There could be more bread around. I'm referring to the money. There is something very important we need to recognize. In many countries, especially in the global north to some extent, we have seen all three acts of charity increasing in the last 3-4 years. Three things: helping a stranger, volunteering your time for a cause, and the third one is making donations coming from ordinary people. The key point being, are the crises we are talking about and the issues we are talking about getting enough attention in the media? You know, thanks to the New Humanitarian, you profile some of the most forgotten and, you know, undercovered or never covered emergencies, and you bring it to the spotlight. So, and recognizing attention is perhaps the most valuable currency in our sector to bring a spotlight, so that the governments are paying attention and ordinary people are also making more contribution. I'm saying this because it's a very difficult choice we need to make at this stage between some of the what is being perceived as life-saving, at the same time recognizing that every crisis is a protection crisis. We heard from Samira how little goes for education. So the whole issue of life-saving, at the same time, we also see a life-saving component when we start talking about education. For example, if children are not being put into a temporary learning space, there is no way parents will go and seek relief assistance, you know, go and get medical assistance. So you can't separate this out one from the other. So coming back to the main point being difficult choices being made, at the same time, we should be putting more effort to get more resources. And that will come if more media houses start doing, including what the New Humanitarian is doing now, to get better spotlight and attention on crises and issues that deserve better care and support and consideration from governments.
There's, I think, different opinions on where that where that financial support will come from. We've heard about these emerging donor countries, frequently, and I'm not convinced myself that there are other countries waiting in the wings to step up to the current Western-led humanitarian system. So, Jana, I might turn to you. You saw you talked about optimism about some of the other people who maybe aren't always considered humanitarian or part of the humanitarian sector, stepping in, being more active, being more vocal. Where does it go from there to changing the funding, the resources that are available for humanitarian action in whatever form that might take?
Well, this one is a double-edged sword. We have seen the rise of private foundations, the influence of billionaires. It's a very divisive one. We have seen some put up funds that are used perhaps in what I, Jana, would call, yes, the good in the right places to put that money. But we've also seen why I call it a double-edged sword, right? We also are seeing how some of these billionaires are influencing a discourse that is not necessarily beneficial in conflicts or influencing positions of political actors. And I think the Israel-Gaza war is a very visible one where you are seeing these battles are being fought at different places. But again, ordinary people give me hope in some ways. So with Uni, I'm with you in that. I remember in 2004 when we had that massive humanitarian need that happened in Asia. I've forgotten the geographical terminology for it. I was living in the United Kingdom at that time, and the United Kingdom government just allocated a small, tiny, weeny amount, and the British public came out in droves and gave billions of pounds until the government was forced to have to give a lot more. And I think we will see people come out beyond just what we see them coming out in solidarity to stand in the streets and, call for what is right. But I really believe in the power of people also willing to put their money where their beliefs are. And as much as I hope they do the same with their votes and so forth and so on. So there is some hope. I think it's not all gloom. I think we are living in that era, right, where we say it's the age of monsters, where, the new great power is not yet really quite clear. So where there is a tension and a tag of, which discourse is going to lead and influence the world going forward. But for a person like me coming from the global south, it's actually quite, I think, refreshing and exciting to feel like there's a sense of possibilities from different spaces and not just have one hegemony that insists on its way because it can pay for it at the expense of others. So in a way, I'm also quite hopeful, Erin, when it comes to that.
Thanks for that, Jana. I'm going to turn the topic over to climate for a bit, and I'll go to Samira for a question. But first, I want to just remind people to, if they have questions for our panelists, to please use the Q&A function. I see a few in there already, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. And also, if you hear anything that really catches your attention, that really makes you think, do feel free to comment on that as well, and perhaps also on social media. You can tag us on the platform formerly known as Twitter at New Humanitarian. That's just a suggestion. So a question for Samira. Afghanistan is facing another year of drought. And we hear, I think, the word resilience a lot. Aid groups want to respond to urgent humanitarian needs while also building long-term resilience. You talked about some of the contradictions of this earlier. Can you explore that a little bit? What do you see in Afghanistan? What does this look like? Is this sort of resilience building happening?
As I already mentioned before, that for currently, as the government is not recognized and we are only receiving the fund for the humanitarian response, and the humanitarian response is also for the 3 to 6 month projects. So in this, we cannot see the resilience. We cannot say that, yeah, through this program, we really do the resilience for the community, for the different type of challenges we are facing, the drought, the displacement, the returnees we are receiving, the earthquake, and other issues in place. So still, like in Avansan, I cannot say much, but there are few actors that they are really working actively on sustainable and resilience-based project. But overall, 90% of all these actors are just busy and humanitarian immediate response for these crises in Avansan. While we're all thinking, like all the humanitarian actors and workers are thinking about resilience. For this, that because we are just facing with displacement and other issues. So to be honest, I just say that we really need a strong commitment for the long-term planning and strategies and investment nationally and internationally, because through these little funding that we are receiving as a local actor, that we are local NGOs, and we are seeing all the critical situation that we are facing, and then the small limited fund that are allocated for the NGOs to respond, is very difficult to think about the resilience. That we should say that, yeah, resilience is happening, but we really need that commitment of the donors to think about the long-term programs and solutions for these all the issues happening in the country, because through these small funding or programs for the humanitarian response is really not enough to think about resilience.
Thanks for that. I think, you know, in Afghanistan, you are in what it on the face of it seems like a unique position, but at the but there are parallels to other crises. You know, I think donors know that long-term support is necessary. They've also cut that specifically because of who's in charge right now, which is the
Yes.
Taliban. So how, and you know, that's a unique situation for Afghanistan, but there are many, many, many other crises around the world where donors do not politically agree with the authorities who are in power for various reasons. So I guess from where you're standing as a local national NGO, how do you get that message across? Is there, I guess what I'm looking for is the next step towards, you know, donors know this, they know the problem, but what is the next step to working around that, or figuring out a way to change that? I don't know, what do you see it from where you're standing?
As I previously mentioned, that the donor community or the donor governments already like identify the challenges in the countries. For instance, Afghanistan is a country that the government is not recognized, and then when they have a plan and program and funding for the emergency response, then why not they can also do something, take a further step for the longer term programs. Because we at a different level of meetings within HCT and Afghanistan, and also different other platform, we just communicate and coordinate with the donors that we have to take a step for the resilience. We cannot, like, millions of dollars are spending just for the short-term programs. So why cannot we think about that, how we can utilize this fund for the resilience? Because always response will not be enough for us. And we cannot do these, find a solution through these small scale programs. And then again, we receive, and there is a decision made between the development donors that, yeah, like World Bank, like USAID and other donors, that, yeah, we will provide Avansan with some funding under life-saving. And because previously there was no fund from the World Bank side and from other development donors in this sector, because they are only having fund for the development programs. So now we are receiving, there are some steps taken, but really need that really need a push. And also not only local NGOs can do that, but as I mentioned before, that all UN agencies, local, national, international NGOs really need to get together to have one voice for pushing all these governments to think about the long-term solutions for the Afghanistan, because 40 million people are not in a place to be just for the cause of the de facto authorities. They should be deprived, and they should be not, their basic rights should be ignored just for the sake of the government.
Thanks for that, Samira. I'm going to turn now to something that everyone sort of raised one way or the other, is the system itself. I think what we've talked about today really begs a question with climate and funding and everything that's happening. It begs a question: is the system prepared for what's coming? Jana, I'll ask you in a second, but first I'll turn to Jeremy. Talking about funding, the big budgets of 2022, I think, are a thing of the past, is the message from donors, anyways. Donor governments are telling humanitarians to get used to it. How should the system itself adjust?
Well, I think the first thing is the system does have to adjust. I think there's been a huge resistance I've been in this, oh my God, 25 years. Sorry, I still feel like I've only done this for 10 years. Going back to my earliest days in the humanitarian system, there has been this resistance to adaptation. And certainly in the last big surge of reforms, now almost 10 years ago, in the 2015, 2016 period, kind of around the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a kind of similar feeling that maybe we'd hit peak humanitarianism, to borrow Heba's term. And a lot of debate around whether to adapt, but also a huge resistance, particularly from some of the big traditional agencies, to really having that hard conversation. And ultimately, we didn't have that hard conversation in 2015, 16. I think now, and particularly given the huge decline in total funding that we saw from 22 to 23, and at the point at which you've got an organization like ICRC laying off 1,800 people, you've got UNHCR contemplating some very, very difficult budget choices as well. I don't think we can defer that conversation anymore. We need to now have the hard conversation on how does the system really adapt. Because the whole idea that we can just keep doubling down on the same business model that we've always had and just keep asking for more and more money from the same small set of, predominantly the same small set of really 4 or 5 donors that finance the bulk of the system, we've kind of reached, I do think we've plausibly reached the limits of that. So what does that mean in practice? I think first we have to go much bigger on localization. We've been kind of yapping in the system about localization for 20 years without nearly enough action on it. You go back and read the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition report from 2004, 2005. The lead finding in that report is that the global system comes in and pushes aside all the local actors, and that's bad for them, bad for impact, bad for the population. 20 years later, we're doing the same thing in Ukraine right now and everywhere else besides. We need to get serious about that, get real about that, and it starts with changing how that's financed. Second, I think we need to go much bigger on cash. Cash is the most effective intervention. We had Refugees International just had a team in DRC over the past few weeks looking at particularly GBV incidents there, which has been really rising. One interesting thing they found was that when programs had switched from cash programs to voucher programs, there were at least anecdotal reports of GBV going up because it exposed the less choice people had, the more they had to resort to negative coping mechanisms rather than the positive coping mechanisms that cash enabled. So cash is a very efficient, very effective intervention, but we're not seeing the full value of that because it's still far too bifurcated, and we don't do enough of it. Third, I think financing through national systems and national partners. That's a form of localization, but in particular for like long-term refugee situations, I don't think we can sustain and justify these huge care and maintenance, hugely expensive, protracted care and maintenance apparatuses. And we need to look at different ways of financing those. And then I do want to give a shout out to what Stephen said earlier about the kind of prioritization work that OCHA talked about. When I was running the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID, we pushed and pushed and pushed and got really nowhere on prioritization. So I think it is a really meaningful thing that the system is finally beginning to take that seriously and make some hard choices. And I think it's important too that we not confuse prioritization for needs going down. And so we need to have that kind of be able to keep those thoughts in our heads at the same time. But it really is time now, almost 10 years on from the Grand Bargain, for the conversation we should have had a decade ago. And I think now we're at a breaking point. We can't defer that any longer.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jana, I'll turn to you with a similar question. I've heard you speak in the past about the humanitarian system and it's made to be reactive versus proactive. It's focused on response by definition versus prevention. I'm wondering how, from where you stand, how humanitarian action becomes more preventative. What have you seen, and what can work?
Well, I wanted to ask the question on system, if you don't mind, and then I'll come to that, because I feel on the other side of the coin, to Jeremy's point, because I agree with him 100%. For me, it's also the politics, right? Because if the politics is not willing, which is really the problem of where we are at, the money will not come out. The right actions will not follow the rhetoric of what is sometimes said. And we have seen, certainly I know from Africa, but from elsewhere in the world, a push for UN reforms. Even now, you see the UN Secretary General Guterres is pushing for this summit for the future as a way of wanting to mobilize a thought process that thinks about a different setup or a different way of working in the multilateral system. And coming from the so-called global south, looking at platforms like the BRICS Plus, which I know there was excitement about BRICS a couple of years ago, more than a decade actually. But this new influx of membership that's emerging in this year, I think is raising a sense of, is there a possibility of not just another system, but something that really operates from a different culture, is, I'll say in small letters, is an alternative in small letters. So there are things like that that I think are important to acknowledge and continue to study and observe. But also within even the current system, for me, I think what South Africa did with taking Israel to the ICJ is a very important thing of also using the system, or at least aspects of it, to make certain, again, I'm coming from a political, make good political points, whether of course there's a follow through on that or not, becomes something completely different. And to the question on responding and not reacting, I think a lot of the work that NGOs around the world are doing on resilience and really hardcore development stuff that I think organizations like Plan, for instance, and I'm sure Samira in her country, are really important projects, because when we help people have the capacity to use the resources that they have within their communities to take care of themselves before a crisis emerges, when a crisis does emerge, their ability to respond and take care of themselves is highly increased. And so that's very important. And I think it's really sad what we see with the diversion of money or the removal and withdrawal of money, to the point that Jeremy and Prof. Stephen are making, that you then take away that very important work that I think girds communities to be able to, take care of themselves. So we do need money going in there as well, and not just focus on reacting to crises when they happen, be they man-made or natural.
Thanks so much, Jenna. I do have a few other questions here, but we also have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to try and mix in a few as we go. I'll take one here that's coming up on my screen from Wesley. There's a growing distrust of humanitarian organizations around the world, particularly within pockets of social media. How can we counter this distrust? That's something we talked about on our couple of our trends pieces. And I think it's a question I found interesting, because it's, as far as I can tell, it seems like the default response from humanitarian organizations is to lean back on traditional concepts of neutrality. But it's clear that that doesn't really matter to people who are promoting disinformation, and perhaps is beside the point to people who read misinformation. So is there a strategy for I guess acknowledging this distrust of the humanitarian organizations in different crises, and doing something differently or doing something about it? I'm not sure if I have anyone in particular in mind, but you're in the corner of my screen, so I'll go to you.
So two things. I will try to respond to your question first, but I also wanted to touch the issue of systems because it's very much part of what we see as concerns in the social media is only a symbol of the system in which, or the ecosystem in which we exist. So first of all, I think it's absolutely critical for aid agencies to recognize this is a real problem and start investing very clearly in communication and step up the investments that we make on communication related matters. This is absolutely critical. And most importantly, there are some really great stories of success and good examples rather than just defending on an attack that is coming from certain quarters. It's also, we need to turn around into those moments into opportunities also to tell the story of impact and the change we are making. I'm referring to simple and sometimes very local ideas that has got the potential to be scaled up at the global level. So this is one thing to recognize. And again, I'm sincerely hoping that we strengthen the collaboration with media houses and so on, so that we are able to put a coherent approach to such challenges. The second one, if you look at the system and the overall ecosystem we are talking about, I also recognize, I was recently in a school in the south of India, a place called Kerala, where some of the school children were asking me, so actually what do you do? What is the type of work you do? And I recognize very quickly that our system and our sectors become so complex that it is very difficult for ordinary people to understand what is that we are trying to do at times. So there was a comment which was made earlier that the good time of humanitarian funding is over and action is over and we are entering into a different phase. So it's, if you look at the system again, it's only as complex or as simple as how we build it. So it's almost like writing a big novel over a period of, you incubate the idea over a period of days and months and sometimes years, and you bring it down to 2 or 3 sentences, then you write the story. And for me, 3 things really matter. One is absolutely the big idea of human values. Any system we are talking about rebuilding, strengthening how much human values matter. The second one is about the local people and the local communities as a critical component, and why we need to start looking at every initiative we do in a much more, I would say, looking at how it impacts and what's the role or how much engagement the local communities have. And finally, as Plan International, I would always say children, and especially girls, as perhaps a third most important variable when we talk about building or refining the system, not just for fit for purpose, but also to be fit for future.
Thanks for that. We have a few questions on localization, and it's something that we wanted to bring up as well. So maybe I'll go to Steve. I know that you had highlighted earlier a bit of progress on some scales on localization. I'm interested in what it is you're seeing as progress for localization.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And it's I wanted to make an observation first because I found this discussion fascinating. I think the really interesting thing to me is the way that the trends that you had outlined in the paper, how many of them have echoed through this conversation, but not just as single trends, as the way they've intersected. And I think that's part of this complexity for all of us in going forward, that you can't just isolate one thing. It's this set of intersecting challenges that make it so difficult for us to try and find a way, to feel like we're finding a way forward. When it comes to localization, I guess I would say a couple of things. Like the maybe to comment where I stopped in a bit my introduction. It's just very clear to me when we go, as part of any sort of mission right now and meet with local actors, that they are extremely clear in their demands of what they want. I'm going to make that in 2 ways. One, to be full and equal partners in the system. That means in terms of recipients of funding, but in also in terms of decision making, and for the system to take a different shape. And this to me is super interesting. The different shape part is, for example, in Ukraine with a number of the smaller national NGOs, there is a misperception out there, perhaps, that I start a national NGO in my home in Canada, And of course, what my desire is to make that an international NGO. That is just fundamentally wrong-headed. For a lot of people a lot of organizations that we work with, they want to have a small community organization. They want to help their neighbors. They don't have some sort of ambition to have that registered as a legal entity, et cetera. And the challenge for us is to figure out how to meet them there rather than the other way around. How do they fit in to this this thing we call a system that isn't really a system? So to answer your question a little more specifically, 80% of humanitarian country teams have national NGO representation. That number has been a little bit more static for a little longer than we want, but I think it's increasingly difficult for the teams that don't have national NGOs on them to sustain that. We have full participation from national NGOs, for example, from an OCHA side in the advisory boards of country-based pooled funds. And we are also seeing in terms of their national NGO involvement in clusters and so on, that those numbers are ticking slightly upward. But I do feel like, even if I can't give you a set of metrics that say, oh, look, here are 10 different metrics that are all shown a statistically significant change over the year, I have more the sense that this is the time when the accretion of these different moves are starting to push them. So it's just not sustainable for us and I'm not talking about it from a financial perspective. It is just not sustainable for us to work the way that we have historically worked.
Thanks, Steve. You talk about kind of the metric kind of ticking slightly upward. And Samira, I'm interested in what you see from Afghanistan, where when it comes to localization, I think you've already talked about how local organizations are struggling to find the funding. What can you add here? What is a way forward for localization here? Because it's something that in panels like this, people always come back to. Oh, localization is one of the ways that the sector will change and adjust to the new realities. How do you see it?
Well, localization in Afghanistan is still in a very initial stage. Even though at the international NGOs and UN agency level, there are some commitments and some policies, and even at a national level, within Akbar network, which is a network for all national and international NGOs, they established a localization technical working group, and also there are some programs for the capacity building of the local NGOs. But in fact, like in practice, this dynamic haven't changed much, because still local and national NGOs are in the forefront of the implementation, with limit or can say no space for the program design, budget, and decision making. And I also cannot say that we should rely on the UN agencies and international NGOs to do these all for us for better. But we really need to build a strong collective local voice. And as a local NGOs, we are trying to, like those they are in form of the localization, we are trying to organize, synthesize other on localizations to improve the local NGOs collaboration. But this is particularly important because nowadays, like there is a reduction in the funding, and this reduction in funding to Afghanistan really increase a kind of competition among the local NGOs. There is a experience of the localization within the Ministry of Education. Like last year, the Ministry of Education announced that the international actors should hand over and do the transition of all the education programs to the local NGOs, and they should stop their operation at the field level. So what happened that we were just very happy that all Ministry of Education is also thinking about localization. So it could have been a good opportunity to see successful localization in practice, but in reality, the result of this handover is really there has been less resource available for the local NGOs and national NGOs just because you're local NGO. So there was reduction on the funding for the local NGOs because of the cost efficiency, and you have to do these things, and all the big budget of the program taken by the international NGOs like procurement, teacher salary, and these all things. So with this, again, like we were just thinking to have a very positive result of this transition, but rather than they put the local NGOs in more stress and in more competition, because every NGO, local NGO, is trying to get that fund, and doing a kind of making a kind of unhealthy competition between the local NGOs. So for that, even the local networks like SEN that I mentioned before, that there is a network that I'm working, they have a local and national NGOs. But running these kind of networks of local NGOs, running volunteer, is very hard. If really we want to take a step forward for the localization, make it practical, to take a practical step, we really need to build and support such a local network that they are working with local NGOs to support financially. Because in local NGOs, due to the limited resource, due to the limited funding, even one person is working instead of 3%. Because when we are asking for the budget, then they are the back donor or the donor or the international NGOs are saying that these staff of the HQ level is not part of this program, so we cannot like give or charge these people. So we have to work in local NGOs. One person should work instead of 3 persons, because we don't have resource. We do not have any other resource to charge them and to work effectively. So this is the situation in the country, that still we are struggling, still we are trying our best to take step and to give what is the rights of the local NGOs, to give that rights to them. And there's also a kind of different interpretation of the localization within the government, within the international NGOs, and some of or most of the local NGOs even are not aware about localization. So this is what's happening in the country.
Thank you, Samira. We're running out of time a little bit, so I just want to, it's something we've talked about, but I'd like to hit it home again, because I think it's just an interesting topic, is you know, if not the multilateral system as it is right now, then what? I think everyone in their own way has talked about how different parts of the system are failing, or the system itself is failing. So if not that, then what is the solution here? What is the next thing? If you burn down the system tomorrow, like what do you do next? So I don't think we need to solve the humanities problems right now, but what is, you know, what is a solution? What is something slightly different that people can imagine? Does anyone want to take that? I see a few people nodding here, so I'm just gonna, oh, Uni's got his hand up, so let's go with Uni here.
Yeah, so I think to begin with, the fundamental issues such as trust, power, dynamics, and cash, you know, something which Jeremy has mentioned before, you know, how are we actually going to strengthen some of those components, recognizing the whole issue of trust deficit, including our bigger agencies and the whole sector willing to trust the local organizations better and even pass on some of the power. So at the bigger picture level, I keep mentioning about the elections taking place in 60 countries, and I believe it's a historical project. Imagine if children had the right to vote. And that won't fix that won't be a quick fix just for the humanitarian issues, but at the bigger level, maybe in such places, the governments or people in power who are waging a war in places like Gaza or Sudan, maybe held account in a different way. Because in many of those places, let it be, yeah, I'm bringing the whole national government issue again and again, because we need to recognize the important role which the NDMAs and the governments play, and the fact that the rest of the actors is a very small but important player. Totally agree. But we cannot forget the bigger actor in this. That's the government. So my wish is that if children had the right to vote, we might have a different world. Thank you.
Thanks, Uni. Jeremy, over to you.
So I think, in picking up a little bit on the point I made earlier about we need to finally have the conversation on adaptation, a big part of that needs to be about how power is distributed in the sector. You know, we don't talk nearly enough about governance systems in the humanitarian sector. Most of virtually all the big organizations are governed by states, and I think we need to look at transitioning to more multi-stakeholder governance models in the humanitarian sector. There was a really interesting paper that was published in Humanitarian Exchange last year that called for refugees to be a part of the executive committee of UNHCR rather than just states. I did some work along similar lines when I was at Center for Global Development a few years ago. I think there's really interesting models when you look beyond the humanitarian sector. So in the global health sector, for example, in Gavi, the board of Gavi is not a state-based organization. It has states on it. It also has civil society. It also has independent experts, and they all vote. And I think that we need to look at different power structures for the sector, because ultimately what humanitarian behavior broadly defined responds to is the power incentives and the financial incentives that exist within the system. And those are the things we haven't really interrogated in a significant way in any of the previous rounds of humanitarian reform. And for that reason, we haven't seen really fundamental change. And so I think we need to go down to those kind of fundamentals, the business model, the governance models, take a hard look at those, begin making changes there around this principle of more subsidiarity, more shifting power to local and global South leaders. If we can't do that in how we're financed, if we can't do that in how we're led, we're not going to achieve that in terms of the outputs of the system.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. I think we're going to wrap up. I'd like to just do a quick round with everyone, maybe in our original order. I had a couple suggested wrap-up questions to get to in under a minute, so maybe just take your pick. But perhaps we can just go with what I asked at the start for panelists and the audience. If there's one thing you could change to make the system a little bit better in your corner of the sector, what would that be? Something that would be a small step to improve your corner of humanitarian response just a little bit. So let's go. We should go start with. Can we start with Samira, please? Samira Nouri in Afghanistan.
One step. Well, there is a need of trust between the NGOs, UN agencies on the local NGOs capacity. If we really want to think about localization and resilience, then we should have the trust on the local NGOs capacity. For example, in Afghanistan, from past 20 years, the local NGOs in response, they build their capacity, but still the issue is that raising among the international and UN agencies that they don't have trust on the capacity of the local NGOs, and they are saying that they don't have capacity. That's why, because they don't have trust. So the thing that I really want to share that to have a trust on the capacity of the local NGOs, because they are the first responder in the community. They have that capacity to respond. When in past 20 years they were there, they did respond. So definitely the capacity is within the local NGOs, and the UN agencies and international NGOs and other donors should trust them.
Thanks, Samira. Jeremy, quickly back to you. So a small bit of change you'd like to see.
I would love to see really meaningful progress on financing locally led action. I think we don't have instruments in the system that have shown they can finance that at any significant scale right now. The country-based pooled funds have probably done the best, but even there, that's a very small share of overall financing in the system, and even there, it's a minority share of what goes through the pooled funds. So I think we need some kind of a new instrument governed in a new way to really change the dynamic on locally led financing.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jana, a small step you'd like to see?
Politics that is people-centered and not interest-centered is what I would like to see.
Thank you. You didn't even give me enough time to write what you're saying there, but now I've got it. Thank you. Thanks, Jana. Uni, over to you. Small step you'd like to see.
Yeah, so one is actually strengthening our communication to demystify and simplify, messages around our system, ecosystem, and our procedures and so on. But most importantly, stepping up and strengthening storytelling. Storytelling for, I would say, different reasons, especially to regain that trust amongst public, including those who make donations, and amongst donors, and governments and so on. So step up communication to demystify and simplify, step up storytelling to build that trust, and also to tell the stories of the change and the impact we bring. And as Plato said, those who tell stories definitely influence and rule societies. And I think we could do more with that.
Those are two things, but thank you, Uni. And Steve O'Malley, without your last word to you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would have, I'm going to repeat a little bit of what people have said because I think excellent ideas. The broader envelope of trust and what we do to rebuild trust at every level. So that's a kind of macro. On a sort of a more micro one with regard to the local NGOs and localization, it's very much what Jeremy said. Continue, get some new models that get money to people, to local organizations more easily, quicker, and then at a greater percentage. And along with that, I would also say this: how to meet local organizations in the sense where they are, rather than expecting them to figure out how to plug in to a very unwieldy system that was not designed for them.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve and everyone. We've reached the end of this conversation, so I just want to thank all our panelists for joining us today for our annual look at the year ahead. I hope we've left you in the audience with a little bit of a sense of the next step, rather than just a sense of dread, but I'll allow that there can be both at the same time. So thanks to all our speakers for your insights. A recording of this conversation will be made available shortly, and we'll send that around. Please do keep the conversation going on social media, sign up for our newsletter, tweet our panelists on social media, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks, everyone.